Meghan Markle has come under fire. Prince Philip, he allegedly gave Prince Harry a warning about getting married to Meghan Markle.
Meghan still has not established an identity of her own.
For years, the world believed a carefully crafted royal fairy tale, one where Meghan Markle was warmly embraced by Queen Elizabeth II. But as explosive revelations surface, that story is beginning to unravel in ways no one expected. Behind palace doors, tensions were rising, trust was collapsing, and shocking decisions were quietly being made about names, access, and loyalty. From the controversy surrounding Lilibet to claims that Prince Harry was shut out, the truth feels far darker than the public ever imagined. Do you think the palace was protecting tradition or hiding something deeper? Drop your thoughts below. Hugo Vickers' revelations. Years ago, millions of viewers sat frozen in front of their screens as the now famous 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey unfolded. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a carefully shaped story that seemed to pull back the curtain on royal life. At the center of it all was Meghan Markle, presented as a wide-eyed outsider stepping into a world she barely understood. She spoke softly, almost innocently, describing moments that felt deeply personal. One of the most memorable images she painted was of Queen Elizabeth II herself, gentle, warm, and unexpectedly maternal. According to Meghan, there was even a quiet moment during a car ride when the Queen noticed the cold and offered her own blanket, a small but powerful gesture that suggested closeness, comfort, and acceptance. That story lingered. It helped build an image of Meghan not just as a royal newcomer, but as someone who had been embraced, even protected, by the most powerful figure in the monarchy. To many, it reinforced the idea that she had entered the royal family with sincerity, only to later face unseen struggles. The narrative felt complete, almost untouchable, until now. As the world moves closer to what would have been Queen Elizabeth II's 100th birthday in 2026, a very different version of events has begun to surface.
Today, as we mark what would have been my beloved mother's 100th birthday,
this shift didn't happen quietly. It arrived with force through a new royal biography written by Hugo Vickers, a historian known for his deep and decades-long study of the royal family. His work doesn't just challenge the earlier story, it pulls it apart piece by piece, offering something far less sentimental and far more calculated. According to Vickers, the image of a deeply affectionate bond between Meghan and the Queen may have been misunderstood, or perhaps carefully constructed. The famous blanket moment, once seen as proof of personal warmth, is reinterpreted as something else entirely. Rather than a sign of closeness, it is described as a simple act of politeness, a quality the Queen was known for throughout her reign. For decades, she had dealt with world leaders, diplomats, and difficult personalities, always maintaining composure. Kindness, in her world, was not always personal, it was often strategic. This changes everything, because if that moment was not about affection, then what else might have been misread? Vickers goes further, suggesting that while Meghan was shaping a public image of being welcomed and cherished, the reality inside the palace was far more cautious. Instead of growing closeness, there may have been growing concern. The Queen, with her lifetime of experience, was not easily swayed by appearances. Behind closed doors, there are claims of quiet observation, subtle distance, and an awareness that things were not as simple as they seemed. Even more surprising is how this shift is beginning to affect those who once supported the original narrative. There are growing signs that key figures in the media, including Oprah Winfrey herself, are stepping back. The same platform that helped amplify Meghan's story is now surrounded by new questions, as more accounts and documents begin to paint a different picture of what was really happening behind palace walls. What makes this revelation so unsettling is not just the contradiction, it's the suggestion that two completely different realities may have existed at the same time. On one side, a public story of warmth, acceptance, and emotional connection. On the other hand, a private world of caution, calculation, and quiet concern. And perhaps the most striking detail of all is this: Queen Elizabeth II was not inexperienced nor easily misled. She spent over 70 years reading between the lines, understanding motives, and navigating complex personalities. If Vickers is correct, then she may have seen far more than she ever revealed. and chosen to respond not with confrontation, but with controlled distance. This is only the surface. Let's uncover more shocking revelations of Vickers. Inside the Queen's final years. As the world pauses in 2026 to reflect on the extraordinary reign of Queen Elizabeth II, a new and deeply unsettling layer of her final years begins to surface. In the second chapter of Hugo Vickers' revealing biography, the calm, dignified image the public had held for decades begins to crack, revealing something far more tense, far more guarded, and far more painful behind palace walls. For years, a powerful narrative has been carefully presented to the world, a story of a duchess fighting for privacy against an unfeeling royal system. But inside the private rooms of Windsor and Sandringham, according to Vickers, something very different was unfolding. The quiet halls of the monarchy were no longer just places of tradition and duty. They had become spaces of suspicion. What makes this account so gripping is not just the emotional distance, it is the level of caution that began to shape the Queen's actions. This was a woman who had lived through decades of global tension, who had navigated political crises and Cold War fears, yet in her final years, she reportedly found herself questioning the intentions of those closest to her. This concern was not presented as mere imagination. The Queen, who had spent a lifetime protecting the dignity of the crown, now faced a world where even family interactions could be seen as material. Because of this, her approach changed in a way that had never been seen before in her 70-year reign. Meetings were no longer simple family gatherings. Trusted individuals were placed in the room, not for comfort, but for protection. Their presence served a clear purpose: to ensure that nothing said could later be twisted, misquoted, or turned into something else entirely. But the tension did not stop at face-to-face meetings. One of the most striking changes described in the biography is what could only be called a barrier between the Queen and her grandson. Phone calls were no longer private exchanges between family members. They became monitored conversations. Senior aides were required to be present, listening carefully, documenting every word. Their role was not symbolic, it was practical. Every sentence was recorded in real time to prevent any future reinterpretation. It was a level of caution that spoke volumes, not just about fear, but about trust that had been completely eroded. This shift reveals something deeper than public disagreements or media narratives. The Queen was no longer responding as a grandmother hoping for reconciliation. Instead, she appeared to be managing a situation she no longer felt she could control. At the same time, there was a heavy emotional weight behind these decisions. Certain moments, particularly the timing of major public interviews during deeply personal family crises, were seen as painful breaches of loyalty. For a woman who had dedicated her life to service and restraint, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Even her silence during this time takes on a new meaning. Her lack of public response was not weakness. It was a calculated withdrawal, a decision to step back, to say nothing, and to allow distance to speak for itself. By the time of her final public celebrations, the separation was no longer just physical. It had become emotional, institutional, and deeply personal. The image of closeness that had been shared with the world stood in sharp contrast to the reality described behind palace doors. And just when it feels like this story cannot get any more intense, another hidden layer begins to surface, one that stretches far deeper into the past. Long before everything escalated, Prince Philip had reportedly issued a quiet red alert, a warning that was never taken seriously at the time. So what exactly did he notice so early, and why was it ignored until it was too late to turn back? Prince Philip's warning and doubts over Meghan's royal image. As we move deeper into the revelations brought forward in 2026 through Hugo Vickers' detailed work, a very different picture begins to take shape. One that quietly unravels the polished story that had been carefully presented to the public. What once sounded like a warm and unlikely bond between Meghan and Prince Philip slowly starts to look less like truth and more like something constructed, piece by piece, for effect. For years, the narrative pushed forward painted Meghan as a refreshing presence within the royal family. She was described as bold, energetic, and somehow uniquely connected to the Duke of Edinburgh. According to that version of events, she wasn't just another newcomer trying to find her place. She was someone who truly understood him. It was presented as something special. Meghan reportedly hinted that she and Philip spoke the same language when it came to the sport, that she understood its details, its history, and even its deeper meaning. It created the impression that, in his later years, Philip had found in her someone who genuinely got him. But Vickers' account challenges this image sharply. Instead of admiration, there was distance. Instead of shared passion, there was irritation. According to these revelations, Prince Philip was not impressed by what he saw. Known for his sharp instincts and dislike for anything artificial, he reportedly saw through what he believed was an act. The supposed knowledge of carriage driving? It didn't convince him. In fact, it appeared to do the opposite. Rather than viewing Meghan as someone trying to connect, he saw someone trying too hard to fit into a role that didn't quite match reality. Her attempts to mirror his interests came across as forced, even calculated. And in response, Philip didn't openly confront or criticize. He did something far colder. He created distance. Instead of using her name, he reportedly referred to her simply as the American. It wasn't affectionate. It wasn't playful. It was deliberate, a way of keeping things formal, detached, and unmistakably clear. In his eyes, she wasn't fully part of the family, at least not yet, maybe not ever. Behind closed doors, the situation became even more telling. While Meghan was reportedly sharing stories of meaningful conversations and growing closeness, Philip was said to be expressing concern, not about her directly, but about Harry. He believed his grandson was being drawn in by something that wasn't entirely genuine. To him, it looked less like natural connection and more like performance. One such moment involved St. George's Chapel. What might have seemed like a simple request on the surface, asking for air fresheners before the wedding, carried a very different weight behind palace walls. The chapel wasn't just a building, it was a symbol. So when Meghan reportedly complained about its smell and suggested altering it with artificial scents, it didn't come across as practical. It came across as disrespectful. For the Queen, this wasn't about preference. It was about understanding tradition and recognizing when something should not be changed. That moment, subtle as it may seem, marked a shift. The image of innocence began to crack, revealing something more complex beneath. Then there was the wedding dress.
And in many ways, minimal and traditional dress with a splendid veil.
While the world admired its beauty, the Queen reportedly saw something else entirely. The choice of a pure white gown, often tied to symbolism, didn't sit right with her. To her, it felt like an attempt to rewrite a narrative, to present a version of reality that didn't quite align with the truth. These weren't loud, explosive conflicts. They were quiet realizations, small moments that, when added together, began to form a larger picture. The supposed bond with Prince Philip, it now looked questionable. The image of being warmly embraced by the family, less certain. And as these layers peeled back, one thing became increasingly clear. The Queen was watching, carefully, silently, taking it all in. But the real question is, at what point does quiet observation turn into decisive action? Because sooner or later, even the most patient monarch reaches a limit. And when that moment comes, the Queen draws a line. What exactly forced her hand, and what happened next behind palace doors that the public was never meant to see? Keep watching to find out. Tensions and the breaking point of trust. By 2026, a very different story begins to take shape, one far darker than the polished image once shown to the world. Instead of a gentle royal adjustment marked by misunderstanding, new accounts suggest intense tension behind palace doors. According to records and detailed testimonies, Queen Elizabeth II was not only observing from afar. At times, she was compelled to intervene directly, not as a grandmotherly figure, but as a firm protector of those who served her. This shift becomes clear in a moment, described in Hugo Vickers' biography. During preparations for the 2018 royal wedding, a food tasting inside Windsor Castle turned tense. Meghan, dissatisfied with an ingredient in a carefully prepared dish, reportedly spoke sharply to a junior catering staff member. Witnesses describe immediate discomfort and a heavy silence that followed. What followed is most striking. The Queen, nearby, is believed to have overheard the exchange. Instead of delegating, she entered the room herself. Those present describe a rare moment, direct, firm, and unmistakable. She reportedly pulled Meghan aside and made it clear such behavior would not be tolerated. Respect for staff, she emphasized, was non-negotiable. It was not a private correction, but a clear boundary set by the monarch. And this, according to Vickers, was not isolated. Another episode occurred at Frogmore Cottage. Meghan allegedly clashed with a gardening staff member over landscaping decisions. What began as a disagreement escalated into tension, leaving staff unsettled. There were also claims about complaints regarding visibility and parked cars affecting the view. Once again, the Queen's reaction drew attention. Instead of formal channels, she reportedly intervened personally, even traveling to address the matter. For her, it was not about plants or property, but principle. Staff were not replaceable workers, but part of a long-standing structure, and protecting them was part of her duty. As accounts grew, a pattern emerged. Reports of resignations, emotional strain, and internal complaints were no longer isolated whispers, but part of a wider concern. Though publicly dismissed, later records suggest serious internal unease. For the Queen, it was not just reputation, it was about people she had trusted for decades. At the same time, another narrative unraveled, the claim of unfamiliarity with royal life. Meghan had described entering the monarchy without understanding its traditions, but later accounts suggest she was supported from the start by experienced aides and advisors. The challenge may not have been lack of help, but resistance to adaptation. This tension escalated by late 2019. Discussions shifted from integration to damage control. Optimism faded, replaced by caution. When negotiations about stepping back from royal duties began, concerns grew over balancing independence with royal status. For the Queen, who had devoted her life to monarchy, this was more than disagreement, it was a challenge to the institution itself. What emerges is not simple conflict, but two worlds struggling to coexist and ultimately failing. This growing body of accounts paints a picture that is far more complex than earlier public narratives suggested. Rather than a simple story of misunderstanding or cultural adjustment, it reveals a system under pressure, where personal interactions became matters of institutional concern. Within the palace, every gesture and every conversation carried weight, and even small disagreements could escalate into broader issues affecting trust and stability. For those who served the monarchy, loyalty and order were not abstract ideas, but daily expectations that shaped behavior and response. At the same time, the individuals at the center of these accounts were navigating intense public scrutiny, where private moments often became public discussion. This overlap between personal experience and institutional expectation created friction that was difficult to contain. As these stories accumulated, they contributed to a growing sense of unease within royal circles, where perception and reality often collided, leaving lasting implications for relationships and reputation. Ultimately, these revelations continue to shape how the period is understood today, leaving questions that remain debated within royal historical analysis and public interpretation. As Hugo Vickers' 2026 biography, Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal History, moves into its most explosive section, it unveils the definitive exposure of the Lilibet controversy. This revelation exposes a far more complex reality. What hidden truth about Lilibet is now forcing the entire royal story to be questioned again? Let's delve into the details. The name that broke the bond. For most of her life, one name remained deeply private: Lilibet. It was a childhood nickname used only by close family, her parents, her sister, and later Prince Philip. It was never meant for public life, never intended for explanation, and always belonged to her most intimate circle. That is why the June 2021 announcement felt far more complicated inside palace walls. To the outside world, it appeared as a touching tribute, a daughter named after the Queen, presented as a gesture of love and respect.
More specifically, her name, Lilibet, became the Queen's nickname from an early age. It was the way that she pronounced Elizabeth.
But behind closed doors, the reaction was very different. According to later accounts, the Queen was not simply surprised. She was shaken, not because of the name itself, but because of how it was used. The decision, sources claim, was not presented as a request. It was delivered as a final announcement, already made and already public, leaving no room for discussion. This created a quiet but powerful dilemma. Challenging it publicly would have meant confronting her own grandson in front of the entire world. It would have forced her to reject a narrative already spreading across headlines. For someone who had spent decades protecting the crown through silence, that was a line she would not cross. But privately, the impact was deeply personal. What the world saw as tribute, she reportedly experienced as something else entirely. The name, once private, intimate, and tied to her earliest memories, had now entered global attention. It was no longer just a memory. It had become something repeated, shared, and potentially commercialized. Inside palace discussions, concerns quietly grew. This was no longer about a name alone. It was about meaning. The Queen reportedly saw it as a shift from personal identity to public branding. In a modern world driven by attention, even private memories could be transformed into value. The emotional weight deepened as she was already grieving the loss of her husband, the only person who had always used that name. The moment therefore carried more than controversy. It carried personal loss layered upon grief. In her final months, she reportedly confided in someone trusted about her grandson's decisions. Her concern was not emotional outburst, but quiet reflection. She questioned the choice to step away from duty, a role she believed was lifelong and inherited responsibility. To her, service was not optional. It was not something taken or left at convenience. It was a lifelong commitment she had upheld since youth. The idea of stepping away from such duty was something she struggled to reconcile. This was not about rejecting family or personal life. It was about the meaning of responsibility and the weight of tradition. In her view, roles within the monarchy extended beyond personal choice. Her disappointment remained quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. What makes the situation most striking is how it reshaped perception. The image of closeness and warmth gradually gave way to distance and complexity. The emotional gap was no longer hidden. It continued to widen moment by moment. In later reflections within royal circles, observers noted that the situation reflected a broader shift in how tradition and modern identity were colliding inside the monarchy. What once depended on quiet understanding and unspoken rules now faced a world where visibility changed everything. Even private symbols could become public assets almost overnight. This transformation left little space for boundaries that once felt absolute. The result was a growing sense of unease about what could remain personal and what would inevitably be drawn into public interpretation and ongoing debate across generations. Ultimately, the narrative surrounding these events continues to be interpreted in different ways depending on perspective and access to information within the royal institution. Some see it as a misunderstanding of others as a deeper institutional tension shaped by changing times. Regardless, it remains a defining example of how personal meaning can become public debate in modern monarchy across global audiences, and historical interpretation debate continues. And if one decision about a name could create such a ripple, what else had been building beneath the surface all along? What unseen moments pushed the Queen further away, until even family ties could no longer bridge the gap? But what truly caused the Queen to pull back completely? And was there a final moment that sealed that separation forever? Stay tuned. Queen Elizabeth's final decision. The deeper you go into the 2026 revelations, the more one uncomfortable truth becomes difficult to ignore. What the world was shown and what was happening behind palace walls were two completely different realities. Nowhere is this contrast sharper than in the timing of the Oprah interview. To the public, it appeared as a moment of honesty and emotional release. Meghan's claim that she checked in on the Queen created an impression of care and concern.
You know, my grandmother has been amazing throughout.
Not knowing what the gender would be, which would be different from protocol.
But according to Hugo Vickers' findings, the reality inside the royal household was far more tense. At that very time, Prince Philip, Elizabeth's husband of over 70 years, was in hospital, gravely ill and approaching the end of his life. Instead of quiet reflection or private grief, the monarchy was confronted with a global broadcast filled with damaging allegations. For the Queen, this was not simply poor timing. Vickers suggests she viewed it as a serious breach of trust. The accusations of racism and neglect were not interpreted as emotional expressions alone, but as targeted claims against an institution she had devoted her entire life to protecting. What followed was not visible anger, but controlled response. There were no public outbursts or direct confrontations. Instead, the Queen shifted into a quieter, more decisive mode. From that point, a clear direction emerged. Harry and Meghan would no longer remain part of the monarchy's official working structure. By the time the Platinum Jubilee arrived in 2022, that shift was already evident. Their presence was distant and carefully managed rather than warm or integrated. One moment stood out in particular: the decision not to allow an official photograph of the Queen with their daughter. Though it appeared minor, it carried meaning. It reflected a monarch who had become more guarded about how her image and presence were used. This was no longer about sentiment, it was about control and protection. As the final months of her life unfolded, that approach reportedly became even more deliberate. According to Vickers, the Queen did not simply step back. She made structured decisions aimed at safeguarding the monarchy's future, ensuring it could not be undermined even by those once close to it. At the center of this effort were her private papers and final instructions. Princess Anne was reportedly entrusted with overseeing these sensitive materials. Within them were carefully prepared decisions that were not emotional reactions, but calculated steps designed to secure the institution's stability. One of the most significant changes involved inheritance. Despite earlier perceptions of closeness, Vickers indicates that Harry and Meghan were effectively removed from receiving major private assets. This was not framed as punishment, but as prevention. There was concern that resources could be used to support further public criticism of the monarchy. At the same time, another adjustment was made regarding royal gifts. Items previously given to the couple were reclassified as crown property. This meant they could not be sold or commercially used. The message was clear: royal privilege existed only alongside responsibility. Even historical narrative began to shift. As preparations advanced for the centenary commemorations of the Queen's life in 2026, decisions were made about how this period would be remembered. The Sussex chapter was quietly reduced, positioned as a minor element rather than a defining one. The emphasis remained firmly on duty and service. Throughout this process, Princess Anne played a central role. Her position reflected the broader divide within the family, between duty and public narrative, between restraint and exposure. Her presence during the Queen's final moments, compared to Harry's absence, became symbolically significant. By the time the world gathered to reflect on the Queen's legacy, one conclusion had become unavoidable: Harry and Meghan's reduced role was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate, carefully executed decisions made in silence, but carried out with lasting precision. What do you think about these new revelations? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.